Assalamu alaikum and good morning to all of you, all the distinguished guests, speakers, and participants. I'm delighted to be back with all of you. Many of you are friends, and others are people I look up to. We are living in very interesting times, and the most remarkable thing that appears to me at the moment is that we are living at a time when the Arab and the Muslim world is becoming more and more democratic, and the West and America are becoming less democratic as we speak. It is ironic for somebody like me who's been studying the absence of democracy, both its political and intellectual causes in the Muslim world, to suddenly find myself at a moment of time in history when the prospects for democracy look better in the Arab world than in the United States. I'm not saying that the United States is less of a democracy than Libya. What I'm trying to tell you is that the direction in which change is happening is opposite. For example, if you look at what happened during the Arab Spring, I have to get something out of my system before I proceed, so otherwise it'll keep bugging me while I'm speaking. It still bugs me that the United States sees relations with the Muslim world through the lens of foreign policy. Except for people who are undercover here, most of the government bureaucrats are from the State Department. Are we a foreign policy issue? Why aren't anybody here from other bureaucracies in the US government? Do American Muslims have anything to contribute to anything else in this country? The environment, the economy, civil rights, human rights, etc. Apparently, it is only the foreign policy. And as long as the United States continues to see relations with Muslims in general through the lens of foreign policy, we will continue to have problems between the US and Muslims because there are so many other issues on which we can work together, and those issues become marginalized and irrelevant, and the constitutive aspects that shape US relations with the Muslim world are foreign policy. Partly, Muslims are responsible for that. For the last 20, 30 years, when we are not talking about our issues, we are only talking about foreign policy. And it has become a habit both with American Muslims and those who deal with American Muslims from all the other administrations. Having said that, coming back to the Arab Spring was fascinating to me in many ways. The slogans. I saw slogans straight out of Patrick Henry on the streets of Tahrir Square. Since 9/11, everybody kept asking me, where are the moderate Muslims? Now I have a zip code. It's Tahrir Square. Go meet them. You want to see moderate Muslims. The slogans were about hurriya, about freedom. That was very important for me, that the language of these rebellions, regardless of what prompted them, what triggered them. I suspect, and most of you probably will agree, that the number one desire that propelled change in the Arab world is a search for individual dignity. That is what they wanted most. But this desire for individual dignity was couched in the language of democracy. And therefore, it raises this tremendous hope that perhaps democracy will flower in the Arab world. I visited Tunisia recently, and all the great hopes that the Tunisian revolution gave me sort of dampened by the realities of Tunisia today. And I realized that just because we have had a revolution will not guarantee a democracy. In any of these countries, democracies are very difficult to achieve. They are aspirations, a desire for equality and justice for all. And we have to work on it every day of our life. You can't say we have now achieved democracy and rest on our laurels. But the fact that there is now a desire for democracy and people are willing to do something about it are extremely positive. Whereas in the last 10 years, since 9/11, the changes that have taken place in the United States have been, needless to say, depressing and scary. Not only the Patriot Act has undermined Amendment 4, 5, and 6 of the Bill of Rights, the Republican Party now has launched an all-out attack on the First Amendment. The anti-Sharia movements in the United States, even though everyone understands that as long as the US Constitution remains as it is, and as long as American lawyers continue to understand the meaning of the First Amendment as freedom of religion to all, these legalistic anti-Sharia movements will have no impact. But yet, laws are passed. But yet, referendums are carried out and passed with huge majorities. It is amazing. At one end, it is baffling. For the last 30, 40 years, hundreds of millions of American Christians have tried to pass two elements of the Christian Sharia in the United States: ban abortion and ban gay marriage, and have failed. I don't know how they expect Muslims, who are less than 2% of this country's population, to impose the entire Sharia on America. Where Muslims are in majority, they have not succeeded in doing that. So I don't understand why this sudden confidence in Muslim political capacity. But then the changes that are taking place in the United States are mind-boggling. They're difficult to understand if reason is your currency, and that is frightening. And one of the manifestations of this is the rise of Islamophobia. Do not underestimate it because it has become mainstream. In the past, when people would ask me, what's the difference between Islamophobia in Europe and in the United States, I would say, in Europe, it is systematic and systemic. In the United States, it's episodic and marginal. Now, I cannot say that. If you look at the latest polls conducted by the Brookings Institution and PRRI, they find that 47% of the people in this country have negative views of Islam and Muslims. But not only that, more than 30% of the population is uncomfortable with Muslims having mosques in America, Muslim women wearing hijabs in public, and so on and so forth. So nearly 1 out of 3 Americans is uncomfortable with visible Muslim presence in this country. Even those who do not watch Fox News demonstrate this intolerance. America is a great country and Americans are great people. And more than that, they also want to look good and great. So when somebody calls them on the phone and says, "Are you a bigot?" Imagine 30% of them say yes, knowing fully well that their answer is loaded with prejudice. That is fascinating to me. And another interesting thing about this rise of Islamophobia is that when you ask people, how do you rate your knowledge of Islam? Those who say they have very good knowledge of Islam have the most prejudicial views about Islam and Muslims. So this is fascinating. A prejudice which is supposedly premised not on ignorance, but on understanding. These are some of the challenges that we are facing. The good things that came out of the Arab Spring is, number one, that once and for all, this whole debate about whether Islam and democracy are compatible, I presume, has been rested. In the past, we thought that it was theoretically possible, but now the demand from the public also shows. The second thing that I loved about these revolutions are that both Al-Qaeda and the United States have been irrelevant to the Arab Spring. No impact whatsoever in either direction. When they went out looking for freedom and dignity, they realized that neither America nor Al-Qaeda was relevant to them. And that is a very strong message to those who think that extremism has become a very deeply embedded element of Arab and Muslim culture. It is not. It was rejected during the Arab Spring. But what it also does is creates great problems for American foreign policy. Now, the United States does not have to convince 20 or 30 people about the merits of its policies in the region. Now it has to deal with 300 million to 1.5 billion people. The problems that the US is now having with Egypt on relations with Israel are indicative how a more free and democratic Arab world and Middle East will have on US foreign policy. I want to make two more points, and then I will wrap up. I'm getting messages from all directions to wrap up. I think that the role of American Muslims is manifold. Number one, they have to combat Islamophobia in the US. If US is seen as an anti-Muslim country, it will complicate its foreign relations with the Muslim world. American Muslims also have to combat anti-Americanism and extremism in the Muslim world, because as long as America sees Muslims as hating America and American values, they will reciprocate. Islamophobia is an emotional response to anti-Americanism. They hate us, so we hate them. And then it's going to become the chicken and the egg problem, which comes first. How do we resolve that? Muslims, in order to become a force against intolerance, against extremism, against prejudice, must first start with reform. If we cannot reform ourselves and eliminate the inequalities which are in our societies, we will not be able to combat inequities in other societies. In this age of Islamophobia and anti-Americanism, I want to leave you all with a message from the Quran. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu la yaskhar qawmun min qawmin asa'an yakunu khayran minhum. This is such a wonderful verse, as if it was written just for this age. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, "O those of you who believe, let not a people ridicule another people. It's just possible that the other might be better than the self." Thank you.